This video is just a short biography as we start the program for us. I just find it's important for you to know who who we're talking to and where you're getting your information from. So I'm going to give you it's just kind of a short introduction to me as a faculty member running the program for us. So it kind of helps you understand where I'm coming from and what my perspectives and training are as a scientist. So I'll start off with this image. This is the image of three sisters in Oregon. I was raised in Oregon, grew up in Eugene, Oregon, and early on in college and in my early 20s, worked a lot in forests on trail crews and as a backcountry ranger for just a couple seasons in the mountains of Oregon. In the lower photo there, there's my beautiful daughter and my wife Carrie, who also works at Evergreen. And so we love to live and play in Olympia. We still like to get up to these high elevation mountain systems and forests of our region. I just love the Pacific Northwest. My training in forests, of course, began when I was had an affinity for forests when I was really young, and then was drawn to them as a college student and as I reached into my 20s. During the time from the late 1970s up until the mid 1990s, the Northwest was undergoing a major change in terms of how we looked at forests, thought about forests, researched forests, and there was a lot of political turmoil over that, and I wasn't immune to that. So in the center here is a picture of Carrie and I, along with several of our friends from that era. Okay, that's a joke. But the reality here is that this stuff was all around us, especially throughout the early 90s, late 80s, and early 90s in the Pacific Northwest. The forest wars and wars over remaining old growth. I call them wars, which is a little bit of a misnomer, but the political battles, at least, over these, and the direct action campaigns over saving patches of old growth were real, had a real impact. Had a strong impact on both the timber industry and the people fighting for protection of these forests in the Pacific Northwest. And there's a lot that we can learn from that. So I come somewhat from that background, steeped pretty deeply in that, both understanding the traditions of direct activism there, and trying to understand all of the kind of political forces at play that were leading to the conflicts of that era. Additionally, I come from a family that were intense resource users. And so from a more kind of rural Northwestern side, I try to understand that component too, and understand how all of this comes together to put us in the places that we are with our forests. My academic training began at Oregon State University. I wasn't in the forestry department there. I was an environmental science student, and I actually worked in prairies quite a bit as an undergraduate researcher. When I wanted to go to graduate school, I was attracted to a program in northern Arizona near Flagstaff, Arizona. So this image comes from my field site for my master's degree in northern Arizona, just north of Flagstaff and below the San Francisco peaks, or the Kachina peaks in that part of the world. This is just south of the Grand Canyon. The research I did there was a multi-agency, multi-user group kind of interface project where a restoration activity was planned around the bottom slopes of the Kachina Peaks, where you can see pine trees, dark green pine trees encroaching into meadow habitat that was historically known to be burned by tribes for hunting and for producing food. Ever since European settlers came in, the tree population really exploded in these prairies, and that's really well documented. And as that happened, there has been a threat both to native grasslands and to the hydrology of systems. So I started my master's project working at a site that had that had to consult with 13 different tribes in order to do any given action. It was run by the Nature Conservancy and the Forest Service, and then I was working with the university, and we all had to be able to come together and come to some agreements. And then on top of that, my research was going to be about tree physiology. So I was really interested in how trees worked, and we got to work with these really detailed probes. So I built these tiny little probes you'd plug into trees, and you'd measure how much water that a tree would use. And so in this graph, you can see these daily curves that show water use of individual trees on individual days of the year. And so I've got 4 individual trees here. You can see what their curve looked like. And this would generate a whole ton of data, and together we could use that to understand how much water the trees were using. This was really important because there are endangered plants in these meadows in this place called Hart Prairie in northern Arizona that are really dependent on the water budget of the whole system. So we were trying to determine how much water went where in the system, and if these encroaching pines that came in following European settlement, if they were actually taking water and evaporating it before it could reach the wetlands downstream in the prairie. And so we did work to figure that out. Ultimately, the prairie was restored. You can see one of the photos here where the Forest Service and the Nature Conservancy together went through and restored a portion of the prairie that had previously been encroached on by pines. So that kind of formed the basis of a master's degree. For my PhD, I went on to work in a completely different system, but at the same university, also at Northern Arizona University. I joined a group that was, again, kind of a collaborative, multidisciplinary collaborative group that was trying to understand how genetic differences in forest trees could affect whole ecosystems. So quite a switch in some ways from the more land management based background that I had as a master's student. As a PhD student, we went deep into the weeds of really understanding how genetics of individual dominant plant species could scale to affect other organisms across trophic levels or other ecosystem services within a forest. Most of this work took place on the Weber River in northern Utah in cottonwood stands that dominate the riversides. And so this was a great model ecosystem for understanding how genes affect whole ecosystems, and it was well funded by the National Science Foundation. So I was really fortunate to get to work with this group. The projects tended to work in these hybrid zones where you have 2 parent species that breed together and create kind of natural genetic gradients. And then we use those natural genetic gradients to investigate all sorts of patterns in how the ecosystem functions, really trying to understand how the whole thing works out. So here's a photo of technology I worked with quite a bit as a PhD student. This is an underground camera that takes images of roots. And I use those to help me construct whole carbon budgets and understand both the water and carbon budgets of cottonwood forests along the Weber River. So here's an example of a graphic, just our cartoon in showing some of the findings from this work. Obviously not a data figure here, but something that's just kind of fun to get your wheels spinning. So what the arrows here are doing is they're demonstrating fluxes of carbon and fluxes of water. Water out of the system, carbon into the system, and then back out. And it's showing that for 3 different locations in this case, or 3 different trees. But this really forms, might help you understand my worldview where I come at forests, the study of forests from. I'm very much a whole systems thinker, and so I like to take the whole system and kind of consider how much of what is going where, how is the whole system working together holistically, not just individual parts, but what does the whole dance look like? If this were a play, I would be concerned with the staging, with the lighting. I want to know how the whole operation is going to look, more than I'm concerned with any individual flux. So I'm kind of a systems thinker there, and a figure like this kind of illustrates what we're talking about there. The group that I was fortunate to work with in the Genes to Ecosystems work really was trying to tie genetics to chemistry of individual trees. We tied that to soil function and how nutrients are released into the soil. We tied that to how roots grow. in the soil, and we tied that to feedbacks to individual trees to see if plants can have what we call extended genetic effects, where the genetic effects of an individual go beyond that individual into the outside ecosystem, affecting things in that outside ecosystem, and then they feed back to affect the fitness of an individual tree. And so this approach is widely known as genes to ecosystems. From there, since 2005, I've been here at Evergreen as a faculty member here at Evergreen, and I've really loved it. It's just a fantastic place to work, and a fantastic place also to continue our research program, which has largely now been based on Northwest forests since I moved here. I still do some work in southwestern forests, so I have some research projects that still go on down there. But a lot of my day-to-day work, of course, happens at Evergreen or happens in our forests. So shortly after I got here, I started the EON project, which is a project tracking changes in our forests on our 1,000-acre forest reserve. That project has included tracking fine root growth. It's included tracking carbon fluxes and tracking diversity of forests. So gas flux, soils, and few animations there, and diversity of forests overall and changes in forest trees. So it's a really fun project, and I love working with students on that. And then since about 2010, I've begun working very intensively with a group out of Oregon State University, actually a former faculty of mine from when I was a student there. I've taken over a project there monitoring the recovery of forests from the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And so we work in forests just northeast of Mount St. Helens, and there's a series of plots, about 800 plots, that every 5 years we go back and do kind of a complete survey of to see how communities have changed over time. So if what I was talking about before is is ecosystem ecology or biogeochemistry, a lot of my work now has also moved into community ecology, and you can see that represented here by the title of this paper and some of what's shown in these images. These are our field sites. Here's my crew, or our crew from 2016 here, measuring in the rain happily in an old growth silver fir forest at pretty high elevation. We were just back there this summer, 2020, in the COVID era, still up there doing measurements and having a great time kind of seeing how those forests change. So this is kind of an appropriate study to end this talk with, as this talk has really been about progression through time, and this study is really about progression through time. How do ecosystems change with time? Because they certainly do. So it's fun to look at them and all their components. So that's it. That's just a little bit of background so that you know who you're taking a program from, and then we can progress into the next step. So that just kind of gives you a little bit to chew on. All right, that's it. I'll see you in class.